Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, will be available on all podcast platforms in late 2019.
Today I'm here with Sara Tang. Hi Sarah, thanks for joining me once again on the podcast.
Hi Jules, nice to be here.
It's great to have you and thank you so much for coming on again. And your last podcast was around episode 49 or 48, Better in Bed. So if anyone wants to go back and listen to that, it's my third most popular podcast.
Everyone wants to get better in bed.
Everyone wants to talk about sex. Today we're going to talk about porn. So I think this might be the second or third most popular. Sarah, how prevalent is watching porn in this day and age?
It is very, very prevalent. So some statistics that, I don't know if it will shock you, but 30 million people watch porn every second. And
30 million every second.
Every second. And of all of the search queries that go into search engines like Google, 25% of it are related to sex or to porn. And the average age of people who first start watching porn, or maybe not watch porn, but their first exposure to porn is 11. I would say that's highly prevalent.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I was doing a little bit of research around this, and they even had a few scientists from a university who were looking for people to be in a study around porn. And they were looking for a control group. So they were looking for people that had never been exposed to porn at all, and they couldn't find any.
They couldn't find any.
I know.
So everybody's been exposed.
So pretty much everybody's been exposed in one way or another, willingly or unwillingly.
Wow, that's incredible statistics. I cannot believe that the average age that kids are starting is 11 years old.
I know. It's really shocking.
And that's probably to do with the access, that it's just there on their smartphones, on their computers, and all the technology has made porn so much more accessible than it was 15 years ago.
And also just search engines, you know, I think you can just type in almost like innocuous words these days. And, you know, kids, they don't really understand perhaps the, you know, connotations of maybe typing in a word like squirting or something. Maybe they're looking for, you know, an animal
water
that's
gun.
squirting or a squirt gun or something. And what pops up is immediately, if you look on search engines, is porn.
Yeah,
right?
My friend's son, years and years ago, back in the beginning of the internet, he misspelled a word and ended up finding gay porn just because I can't remember what it was that he misspelled.
Yeah, completely innocuous. Yeah.
So it can happen that way for sure. I remember one of my students saying to me, because we do a sex ed question and answer session where they can put all their questions into a box, and then we have a panel of teachers and we all answer their questions, which is really fantastic.
Great.
And we've got, different male teachers and female teachers from all different areas in the school. And the kids absolutely love it. But I remember one of them coming up to me and saying afterwards, how did people masturbate before porn online? And I was like, they used to use their imaginations. And he was like, wow.
Mind blown.
What a concept. And that really stood out to me because I hadn't considered that it's kind of all that this generation knows about sexual stimulation.
Yeah.
And they don't have the good old-fashioned, imagination that we used to use when we were kids. Oh, well, sorry, I'm not putting you in my generation. I'm 20 years older than you. No, I'm only 13 years older. But my only access to pornography as a kid was my dad's Playboy magazines under the bed. That was it. And so it was just fairly tame photos of women.
I didn't grow up with porn either. So I grew up in Singapore, and Singapore is highly censored. I mean, you can still get around with it. But I think, the age thing is interesting because there was a time where you didn't really have that much internet porn. So I remember having to kind of sneak down into the study room and use the computer there. And I would have to wait about 5 minutes for one clip to download. And all that time for 5 minutes, I'm furtively looking over my shoulder and going, is mom and dad coming down?
That's hilarious. I remember a time when I was in my early adulthood, in my early 20s, where we would watch videos, DVDs.
Oh, yeah, DVDs.
Yeah, so you'd have a DVD of some porn, and there'd be a whole story. They're on the ship and they meet up on the ship. And then I think this is the only porn I watched on DVD.
No, I remember that too.
It took a long time to get to any sex. You had the whole story and, the sort of the courtship and the growing of the tension and all of that. But now you don't really get that anymore. It's just straight into it pretty much.
Yeah. There was a time where there were these huge porn studios like Vivid Entertainment, and they would make these storyline blockbuster DVDs. They were almost like going to the movies.
Yeah.
There would be almost like takes on
parodies on airport, that airport where the plane crashes or whatever they were.
Parodies of actual movies.
Debbie Does Dallas. And, no, was that a parody of a movie?
No.
But these are some of the ones that were out, weren't they?
Yeah.
And then this is really interesting because before we started this podcast, I was just telling you about The Butterfly Effect by John Ronson. And he goes into the porn industry in LA and interviews porn producers and porn stars, and they really do talk about how the introduction of the internet and smartphones and access to live streaming and all these porn sites where you can access it for free has just completely changed the landscape of pornography and their ability to really make a living from it. It's all changed.
It is all changed. And I think even the porn industry is going to evolve much more in future, which we can talk about, because I actually think that nobody's making a lot of money from mainstream porn these days because it's all free. Right. And so I think that the big porn producers are trying to move into new areas like VR porn and stuff like that. And
so virtual reality porn where you can actually feel like you're a part of it.
Yeah. And going back into more of that storytelling, kind of experiential storytelling. That's what I mean.
That'll be interesting to see if that does evolve. And I think it will be fairly soon. I think you're spot on.
I think it's already happening.
Yeah. It was so interesting. Last night I was watching Black Mirror where you could choose the way the story was going to go. Have you seen that one?
I'm a big fan.
Bandersnatch or something like that. The episode where you literally can use the remote control to click on the pathway that the guy goes on. So it's much more interactive.
Yeah.
And I was able to choose the storyline or go back and re-choose. And it was really fascinating. I've never experienced anything like it before, but that's where porn's heading.
Yes.
So you can almost pick what's going to happen. And then there's going to be virtual reality sets where you're physically involved.
Yeah, it's the ultimate customization and it's the ultimate experience, right?
Oh, and you know what? I didn't tell you, but I was in Shenzhen recently. We went up for a girls' weekend and we met this random Aussie guy called Baz. And he was in the sex doll industry. So he was up there sourcing these dolls and he was talking about how they are becoming much more VR, and the technology, how it's evolving, and they're super expensive, but they're incredibly popular. And that's a whole nother industry that's taking off.
Well, that's an industry that is taking off, I think, in parallel with the porn industry. So what the sex dolls, but also what they call like teledildonics, which is sort of the sex toys that sort of accompany the VR experience and that you could use remotely.
So you would need to have the full VR experience. You'd need to have a sex doll or something, or a watermelon,
or something,
or a pie.
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm saying this. I was thinking of American Pie. You need to have something to be able to have the experience.
Some physical stimulation, right?
Yes. What do you think are the negative effects of watching porn?
I think that most mainstream porn is directed for the male gaze. I actually think because of this is quite misogynistic in some ways. You get very stereotypical portrayals of, women as these willing, subservient creatures that are always up for it and sort of male dominance, right? And then you also get the sort of stereotypical portrayals of bodies, that are considered sexy. So you've got the fake boobs, and then you've got the, hairless everything, like no body hair at all. Then you've got the sort of what you call like the very tight labia on the women. So all of that is all portrayed like through the male gaze. And I think that is kind of dangerous, I feel, especially if you're watching porn at a young age. So we said like that first exposure of porn being 11, it can actually set a lot of unrealistic expectations, if you don't have a good sex education. So porn in many ways is entertainment, but because we have such a vacuum that is sex education, it just exists a lot of the time to fill that vacuum, right? And that can be, I think, quite negative. The other thing I think as well that can be negative is that porn often is watched in secret, and there can be a lot of shame and guilt that accompany porn watching. So that can be a block on intimacy if you're a couple. It can also be just a very lonely and isolating experience if you're watching it, and then after that you feel really bad for watching, especially if you're exploring a fantasy that may be a bit taboo, and then you watch it and then you go, oh God, like, why am I watching that? And you judge yourself for it. So that can also be negative.
And I did watch a TED talk. I can't remember what it's called, but it's where this guy was talking about how porn can become addictive. And in actual fact, then people can't get stimulated in relationships because they're not having the porn experience.
Yeah. I think it's called Your Brain on Porn, but
yes, it is.
Yeah,
you're right.
It is. And I think it's still controversial whether, you can actually have a porn addiction per se, but you can definitely have a porn dependency, and you can definitely exhibit a lot of compulsive behaviors around porn. And the reason for that is that the way porn is presented with high-speed internet, with smartphones, is that you have this just endless novelty and diversity of very, very short clips of porn. And it kind of trains your brain to expect this kind of instant gratification and constant novelty. And when that happens, the way porn works on your brain is that it kind of like stimulates dopamine. So you get this dopamine rush. And what happens with like prolonged exposure to dopamine in your brain, especially if you have a young brain, is that you need more and more of it. So you need more and more of the stimulation to get that same dopamine rush. So that's what leads people to watch more porn or watch more intense scenes to get the same dopamine rush. And also, if you think about porn and how it's used, right? Like it's really used as an accompaniment to masturbation. And if you really think of, that experiment about like Pavlov's dogs, right? And the whole thing about having positive reinforcement associated with something. So in Pavlov's dogs, it's sort of, they associate the whistle with food, right? So instantly, whenever the whistle is blown, the dog starts salivating, right? So it's the same thing with porn, right? An orgasm is pretty much like the biggest, most positive reinforcer out there. Every time you're watching porn and you're associating it with an orgasm, you're getting to the point where even if you're thinking about porn, you're not even watching it, it's already exciting to you. And I think what happens after that is when you are having, especially for young brains, if they are exposed to porn like constantly, it reshapes the wiring of your brain. And that's when it results in things like desensitization. It results in like erectile dysfunction, even in young men.
Yes, I've heard that. It can happen to teenagers, can't it, due to porn, and that they can't get a hard-on when they're in a real situation because they don't have the porn. And it also can affect women and body image and the way that they feel that they need to remove all of their hair because that's what's seen. And in actual fact, our pubic hair forms many functions. It provides a barrier for germs, and it helps with the sweat glands, and it helps with the friction so that you don't get rubbing and things like that. But these young girls don't necessarily know any of that, and they take it all off because that's what they think is men really like. But in actual fact, men like all sorts of different things. But you should be doing there's diversity, but you should be doing what you like, not what other people like, shouldn't you? Or unless you sort of come to an agreement. But
yeah, I think that one of the things that I would say porn is really responsible for is probably the growth in this industry called labiaplasty.
Have you heard about that? I have. Is that like designer vaginas?
Yeah, like designer vulvas, really. But a labiaplasty is pretty much like a surgical procedure. It's a cosmetic surgical procedure which you go under, which trims the labia minora to make it sort of tight, tucked and tight inside. There's obviously many, I mean, I don't know if you know this, but if you've seen like loads of vulvas side by side, you'll know that there's tons of varieties in the way vulvas and the lips of the vulva present themselves, right? Some are a little bit more flowery, some are a little tighter, some can extrude quite a lot, right? But with porn, you kind of only see really the tucked in vulva. And I think because of that, labiaplasty has just grown so much in popularity. And one of the most requested forms or designs of labiaplasty today is called the Barbie. And
so everything.
Which is kind of ridiculous considering Barbie actually absolutely has no
vulva or vagina.
No vulva or vagina. But like the idea is that it's all tucked in and you can't really see it until like a woman opens her legs.
Yes, I know. So that's such a shame, isn't it?
It is.
Tell me the difference between a vulva and a vagina, just for our listeners.
The vagina is actually the canal. So it's, what do you say, like the opening, right? The hole, the opening, the orifice. The vulva is the lips that surround that opening.
Right. Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. I actually know that a lot of people get that mixed up. As a sex educator, that's one of the things that I always say, like, it's the vulva, not the vagina.
Yeah, and I think you might have taught me that in our last podcast.
Yeah. But you know what? This works on men too, right? So I don't really feel it's just women.
Yes, tell me about that.
Men too experience these sort of body issues. The biggest expectation for men, which you see on porn, is that men have hard penises that are
quite big.
Are big. They're 8 inches long, right? That's what's selected on porn as well. And there's a lot of performance anxiety that's created also in men. If they don't have penises of that size, or if their penis isn't hard all the time, which is also natural, by the way, because sometimes it goes up and down according to your arousal process. And most of the times in porn, like the performer's actually on Viagra, right? So it's actually not a natural state of being. It's a performance. But again, there's a lot of performance anxiety around that. And then,
correct me if I'm wrong, I think the average size of a flaccid penis is like 3.5 inches. Yeah. And then the average size of an erect penis is about 5. Yeah. So, the 8 or 10 inch penis is an anomaly.
It's
but
not
that's
normal
pretty much what you see in porn.
Exactly. But men do have these hang-ups where they're like, does size matter? Is probably one of the biggest questions that I get asked on my Instagram commonly by men.
And what do you say to that?
I say that it depends, because I actually don't say that it doesn't matter, because I think to some people it does matter. But I think it matters less than what men actually think it matters. And there's lots of studies that women don't actually put it on their top list of criteria.
And there's women who feel that some penises are too big and they won't go there.
Yeah, exactly that. There's some women who feel that as well. So actually, I think it depends because also women have different sizes too. The way their vaginal canal is shaped, how deep it goes. It depends. Like some women may be size queens. They like to call themselves size queens, perhaps because they have a vagina that is actually a little bit more accommodating for a penis of that size, that is big. Whereas somebody who is maybe a little bit smaller might find that extremely uncomfortable. So ultimately, it's all about compatibility. But it's also not the be all and end all, right?
No, you can have somebody with it, not enormous, but a big penis who just can't use it very well or has no other technique, no foreplay.
No foreplay. I mean, what's the point
sex.
of that?
So get out. Exactly. I think we've talked about this before, but that saying of men love to have sex and women have sex to get love. Have you heard that?
I have heard that.
Yeah, and I think that women are looking more for a sort of an overall connection quite often. Of course, there's a stereotype, but there's a lot more to it than just the motion in the ocean.
Yeah, but I think even as a skill of sex, having a big penis is not a skill.
No,
it's just something that
you got to work with.
You were born with or not. Like, whereas I actually think that all kind of sex is really a skill. Communication is a skill. Exploration, being able to understand your body, that's all a skill, right? Being able to pleasure your partner, being able to feel pleasure while your partner feels pleasure, all of that is a skill. That's all part of being better in bed, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but penis has nothing to do with that. That's just what you're born with.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Same about breast size and all of that and shapes of the vagina. I think the other thing that porn has done for women is increase breast implants as well. Like there's a big sort of push. I mean, in the US, I read about this girl who got breast implants as a gift from her parents for her high school graduation. Like, to me, that's just mind-boggling, and I can't ever imagine having that operation.
But it's not to shame people who have the operation.
No.
I just think that it's really examining where is it come from and why. And having that deep awareness inside yourself to be like, am I really doing this for the right reasons,
Yeah, exactly. And are you going to be able to live a healthy, happy lifestyle with the size that you've selected as well?
Exactly, yeah.
Many women get them very large.
Yeah.
And Sarah, what are some of the positive effects of watching porn?
Okay, well, maybe I should say this now. Like, I'm actually not anti-porn. And if anything, I'm actually pro-fantasy and I am pro-masturbation. So all of that is very healthy.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
Yeah. I obviously have issues with mainstream porn. I don't think that it necessarily is the most healthy portrayal of sex or of women particularly. But I actually think that when you use porn responsibly and ethically, we can talk about that a little bit later. Porn can really help to, get you in the mood. It can help to enhance fantasy. It can even in some ways spark a conversation with, if you're in a couple and you watch something together and you see it and you go, oh, maybe that's interesting. Is that interesting to you? Maybe we could try this. It can create lots of ideas for the bedroom, which I think could be healthy.
So it can spice things up a bit or add a new kind of life to things if they go a bit stale.
And I think it also can relieve sexual tension, and that's sometimes a good thing, like just reduces like bad decision making on a night out or, on a business trip, right? Like if you're married in a committed partnership and you don't want to go outside that relationship, yet maybe, your partner's not available. Then these are very practical things. You could actually just watch porn and that could actually reduce things like infidelity, things like that. One other thing, I also just interviewed Carmen Yao, who I know is on your podcast.
Yes.
And so Carmen she's a woman with disabilities. She's got spinal cord disability and she is in a wheelchair. And we had a really good chat about disabled porn. And in her view, she actually finds that very empowering because people who watch this porn with, performers with disabilities, they have a certain name for them. They're called like devotees. And in some ways, they kind of like have a fetish for people with disabilities. But with disabled porn, like a lot of the porn is very much empowering because it shows people who conventionally may not be considered, sexy or sexually attractive. but yet showing that, there are people who really do find them so. And there's actually a whole niche around it. And she finds it very empowering.
Well, that's really good to hear. And that's a good reminder of some of the positive impacts that porn can have on different communities.
Yeah.
That's really cool. How do you think people can self-regulate porn watching?
Well, I think there are practical ways, and then there are sort of like mental and emotional ways. Like practical ways, you really just need to start with just get an accountability partner. I think that's like the biggest thing, is to really just be like, this is something that I'm not really in control of. There are programs like pop-up blockers and web filters and stuff, and get whoever it is, get a sex coach or a friend to be like, I'm going to set the password for you. So there are things like that, and things like changing your habits, making sure that you're not bringing your smartphone into your bedroom, which is always a good idea anyway, but I know we're all guilty of that, me included. But, maybe you change your habit and be like, okay, there's a filter now. I'm only going to use my smartphone in the living room. And perhaps if you have a living situation where there's multiple people, then it's harder for you to actually watch porn. But I also think that what you need is really just a deeper awareness of your habits with porn. And, even if it is taking like a log of all of the time that you've spent watching porn every single day.
I bet there's an app on
like
your phone.
Literally just log it, for a month. And if you actually add that all up and you see how much time you spend watching porn and be aware of that, like be conscious of that, then that can already be all you need to really change your behavior. And then using that time almost to focus it on healthy behaviors like, spending time with your partner, or maybe, personal development, like taking up a sport or a hobby or something, then that could also work as well, together with some of the practical
So you have to
blockers.
look at whether you have a balance in your life and whether it's not too skewed towards watching porn. What do you think about teenagers watching porn? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Do you think parents should be having conversations with their kids about it? Should it be talked about in schools?
I think it's unavoidable, to be honest. I don't think that I wouldn't judge it, because I think the minute you judge a behavior to say, don't do it, it's bad, they're going to do it anyway because of the accessibility like we talked about before. So I think it's more about how to do it responsibly. And also being able to give teenagers the right amount of sex education to be able to help them discern that this is not reality, right? That sex is, different from what they're being shown on porn. I also think that in general, sex should just be an ongoing conversation. And if I was a parent and I knew that my teenager was watching porn, because really, how could you not, right? Even if you have all of the filters in your home computer, they probably got it on their friend's computer
or their phone
or their phones. I mean, there is absolutely no way you can totally regulate it. I would actually just use it like a conversation starter to say, well, what do you think of porn? And to not necessarily, dive into like a critique of, oh, porn is bad, but just have a very open discussion with your teenager. Well, what do you think about it? And what do you think of some of the practices? And, where do you think it differs from reality? And see what they say. I think talk to them as an adult about it and have them sort of critically think through, what porn actually means to them.
I think that's really good advice. Do you think it should be a part of sex education programs in schools?
I think a lot of things should be part of sex education programs.
And when we're talking about Hong Kong, and this came up in our last podcast, there's a lot of schools with no sex education programs. So that really needs to be addressed. My school is not one of them.
But I do think that the underlying principles that porn isn't very good at is something that we could include into sex education. So for example, things like the stereotypical portrayals of men and women, right? Things like consent. There's a lot of non-consent in porn, for example. There's the pizza girl that comes to deliver the pizza, and then suddenly she's in the gangbang,
but she hasn't consented to anything.
To anything, exactly. If anything, she's like, I need to do my job.
So consent and condoms are rarely addressed as well.
Condoms. And the fact that porn is a performance and it's not necessarily the real way that men and women have pleasure. I think pleasure education is really important, right, in sex education. So, porn can always be used, I think, as a counterpoint to actual sex education to say, well, what is pleasure? How do you get pleasure? How come when in porn, there's absolutely no contact with the clitoris, yet there's women who seem to be having multiple orgasms all the time, right? How is this possible?
Yeah.
Right? I think just using it as a counterpoint and using it as, a reference for critical thinking, I think would be the way I would suggest.
Yes, absolutely. And also when it comes down to understanding what pleasures you, masturbation is one of the best ways to find that out for men and women. And there shouldn't be any shame involved as long as you're doing it in the privacy of your own home.
I think also in sex education, what I would do is I would probably teach teenagers or young people how to spot some of the red flags that will show when porn is overtaking their life. For example, there's a red flag if you are consistently choosing to watch porn over other aspects of your life versus going to see your friends versus over engaging in real life sex if you're, if that's what you're doing. Or if you are, unable to be sexually aroused without porn, then again, that is another red flag. But being able to be conscious and thoughtful about how porn affects your libido, your sex drive, the rest of your life is really important, I think, for a young person to know.
Do you think that there's any link between violence and porn?
Well, I think there's lots of contrasting studies around that. And from what I've read and what I've seen is, I think, more correlated rather than causative in terms of porn and sexual violence. I mean, we do know that mainstream porn has a lot of non-consent and has a lot of misogynistic scenes. We do know as well that the mainstream porn industry has a history of exploitation with very, very young performers that aren't over a certain age. Or if you've watched any of the Netflix documentaries about porn, like Hot Girls Wanted, or
yes, I have.
Oh my goodness, it's really quite sad, and how they really exploit the performers into doing more and more intense or degrading scenes because as they go through their careers, less and less opportunities come up. So
yeah, they're on the shelf at 25, aren't they? And, these girls are of the age of consent. The ones we were watching, they're 18, but they're so young and they're after this glamorous lifestyle full of money and kind of fame or materialism. But in actual fact, many of them don't find that.
No.
And it's quite sad to see how it impacts some of their self-esteem and their self-image.
Yeah. I think it's very good to be aware of all of those things that are part of the mainstream porn industry.
I wonder, do you know of any studies where the violent porn, can it lead to violent behavior in the community? I guess not. I mean, there's a lot of people that have all sorts of different fantasies and they watch them in porn, but it doesn't mean they act on them out in the real world.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with porn is that often it can be an escape from reality, right? And it can be a place where people can go and explore their taboo sides, right? And they can be absolutely upright, morally upright people that would never, ever do anything in that arena. But with porn, it allows them an outlet to explore things that are taboo. And maybe, even with the non-consensual stuff in porn, perhaps that is the safest place for them to explore that. Right?
Yeah, and then maybe it means that they're not exploring it out in the community, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Do you think that everybody kind of has fantasies? Is it very common, and is it an important part of our sort of sexual behavior?
I do think everybody has fantasies. I think all fantasies are very healthy. It's just how we manage them and deal with them. I think they are part of our erotic mind. And if we didn't have that part of our erotic mind where we could generate fantasies, our sex would be so functional and monotonous and boring.
Yeah.
A lot of the times fantasies is what makes things interesting. They create anticipation. We explore things that are taboo. It's a place where we can really play. We don't have to worry about disappointment or vulnerability or confusion or anything in the real world. In your mind, it's really free to just play and go where you are and explore things.
And then when does a fantasy become unhealthy?
I think a fantasy becomes unhealthy if it is taking over your life.
Back to the red flags you were talking about before, same kind of thing.
Or if you are really trying hard to make it happen in real life and you are not considering perhaps the other people that may be impacted by it, right? So if you are with a partner, if you're really actively trying to make them actualize your fantasy, which they might not be into, that's also something that you need to talk about and work on and manage.
And that's why communication around sex in relationships is really important and consent is really important.
Correct. But on the flip side, it could also be really positive. I mean, if you go to your partner and be like, actually, I have this fantasy and I don't know if you're into it, but perhaps we could explore it and it could be fun. That could be also really healthy and, a way of connection for both of you, because the idea that you're already putting your fantasy on the table is really an act of vulnerability to share something with your partner.
So it's going to increase the connection anyway, even if you don't follow through, if your partner's not willing to follow through with the...
Absolutely. It's going to increase connection. It really depends, even if your partner's not into it, and it's fine if your partner has their own boundaries around it. But even if he or she is there to just listen and be the container of it and be like, okay, I understand that. And I think that's already very powerful.
Would you say that porn is entertainment or educational?
I think it's entertainment. So the metaphor I like to use is it's like learning how to drive by watching The Fast and Furious. Would you do that?
No. Exactly. That's brilliant. That's a great analogy. Because a lot of porn is fast and furious.
Fast and furious.
There's no going out for dinner. No. There's no sense of humor. There's no hand holding.
Absolutely
there's no
not.
foreplay.
Yeah.
There's no dinner and romance. Yeah, it's all missing. Generally.
It is.
Teenagers should not look at porn as an educational platform about how to have sex.
No, they shouldn't.
And they should seek out other avenues, whether it be school or the sex education show in the UK or Kids Health. There are lots of different websites and organisations which are really good sex education outlets for teenagers.
Yeah. I would also say that even as a form of entertainment, there are better and more ethical forms of entertainment, even in porn. So there is definitely good porn and bad porn out there. So, when people go, oh, I hate porn, it's so awful, it's so misogynistic, I always say, but you're just watching the free porn and you get what you pay for, right? So you don't pay anything, you get the shit for it, you get the shit stuff. So one of the things I would always say is if you want to actually get high quality porn is to pay for it.
So when you're talking about ethical porn, what do you mean?
Ethical porn is non-exploitative. They make sure that the performers want to be there and they pay their performers very fairly. They also celebrate things like sexual diversity in their scenes. So it's not just all according to the male gaze and, that stereotype that we talked about. A lot of the times they feature many different kinds of bodies, many different kinds of sexualities. And there is also a lot more focus on female pleasure. I would say that there's a balance of focus. So while mainstream porn just focuses pretty much solely on male pleasure, ethical porn puts the balance between both male and female pleasure. And one of the platforms I really, really like, and she's an actual director from Sweden, is the work of Erika Lust. So she has this amazing series called X Confessions. And she takes from the internet people who write their fantasies online. And she picks and selects the one that she really is most inspired by. And then she creates an entire porn film about it. And it's extremely high production value, very cinematic. All of the things that I said, focus on pleasure, both male and female, sometimes features transgender performers. all kinds of
Diversity.
So yeah.
I've heard of her before, and it's very artistic and
Very
creative
artistic.
and sensual.
Yes.
All of the things
I would
which
say
are
that.
missing from a lot of porn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other platform I also really like is Cindy Gallup's Make Love Not Porn. So Cindy Gallup's actually been on the TED stage talking about her platform, and she talks about how porn is just not realistic portrayals of sex. So her platform, Make Love Not Porn, is all about realistic sex. So she gets these amateur couples who indulge in real life sex, and then she categorizes them according to like funny sex, period sex, all the things that actually make real life sex. You have sex on your period, but nobody in mainstream porn has sex in their period, right?
No, I've never seen that. Yeah.
Funny sex. A lot of the time sex is very funny and you laugh.
Things can go wrong.
Thinking goes wrong. Things are awkward. And she has videos around that. So she categorizes them, and it's all about sort of sex in the real world, because she says that we need more realistic portrayals of what sex actually is.
Yeah, so I think that's so true. That's great. And thanks for those recommendations. Yeah. Hopefully our listeners will go and check them out. Yeah. What would you advise somebody does if their partner's watching porn without them? This happened to me. I remember in my 20s waking up to my boyfriend standing in the middle of the lounge room masturbating to porn, and I had no idea he was doing this or that he was even out of the bed. And I wasn't so upset about him watching the porn. I was upset that it was hidden from me.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think that's probably where I would start. I mean, if you find out that your partner is actually watching porn, then I would maybe just stop before confronting them and just ask yourself, what about this upsets me? So is it that my partner just didn't tell me that he was watching porn? Is it that I'm threatened because I feel that he would rather watch porn over be with me? Is it that I just can't stand the porn that he's watching because it's misogynistic? All mainstream porn is misogynistic. I would actually just take a moment before saying anything to actually ask yourself what makes you uncomfortable about this situation. And then I would then probably look at your sex life itself and be like, see if you feel like there is anything wrong or anything missing. Again, I feel like often we get so uncomfortable around porn, and there's this fear and dislike of porn because we're actually missing something in our sex life. And then after you've done sort of that little bit of like mental awareness and reflection, I would then talk to my partner about it. And I think when talking to your partner about it, it's okay to express what you feel, but you need to also understand that your partner may have something, his or her own opinions that might not agree with you. And it's really important not to blame porn for all your sex problems. And then maybe after you talk about it, you can try to set some parameters or reach a compromise around porn. Again, I feel like I'm not a big advocate of the whole, you must not do it. You don't do it. Because I actually think that all that does is actually just
makes it go underground.
Yeah, it makes it go underground. It takes the porn watching into secret, and your partner's still gonna watch porn. They're just not gonna tell you about it. And then you're gonna get even more pissed because they've been doing it without you. I'm more of the school that try to set some parameters in terms of trying to reach a compromise. So is it more about you can watch porn, but make sure that we have a balance of sexy time, right? Or is it maybe that we watch porn together? Or is it maybe that, you only watch porn on weekends? You can still watch it, but maybe on weekends, and then the rest of the week you're with me. So something like that. Or is it maybe just ethical porn that you watch? So maybe not the mainstream porn. So at least I know that, this is porn that I think is a lot more balanced in its worldview kind of thing. So,
and probably psychologically a bit more healthy as well. So how do you think the porn we've watched has changed over time? Like, it's really interesting. When this guy that I was dating in my 20s who had the porn in the lounge room, he'd actually ordered a whole lot of hardcore porn tapes because there was no internet back then from Canberra. So in Australia, you could buy like in brown paper wrapping and it would get posted out much more hardcore porn than what you could get regularly. And I discovered a massive garbage bag full of these hardcore porn tapes in the shed, and it was just like, oh my God. So not only is he like doing it without me, but he's buying it behind my back and it's quite hardcore. So that was a red flag and a concern to me. There was still hardcore porn available back then, but you had to work harder to get it. You didn't have to just have to go on the internet. How do you think porn has changed over time?
Well, I think it's become much more readily accessible. In some ways, I think become much more, because there is breadth and variety. I think in some ways that's good because you have every single niche available. So the people who like porn with performers with disabilities can find that, or, you know, whatever fetish you may have, no matter how niche it is, there's probably some kind of porn out there for you. And that's great because it makes people feel like they can connect and their fetish or their sexuality is valid in some way. But I think in some ways it's also quite negative because I think what you also start to see is that you see these sort of more violent and transgressive and aggressive scenes creeping their way into mainstream porn as well. You know, there are niches that always kind of trouble me, like, especially which are kind of like non-consensual stuff, which like revenge porn and, you know, animal porn. Yeah. And, you know, rape porn and stuff like that.
Child porn.
Yeah.
There's a lot of areas that should be like banned.
Exactly. So that kind of stuff also disturbs me as well.
And that's a shame because that all becomes so much more accessible.
Yeah.
And then deviants can become more sort of entrenched in it, which is a sad thing for our society. Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on that we haven't mentioned so far?
I think it's just really making sure that people have more healthy porn resources. If, you know, you're listening out there and are watching porn, you know, I like to encourage you guys to check out Erica Letts and Cindy Gallup. I also think that if you are looking for ideas on sort of like watching porn as a couple and trying to sort of connect more intimately through the medium of porn, I also think that there is a great resource on lovingsex.com. It's created by the Alexander Institute. So it's actually this genre called edu porn. It's something that I actually watched a lot of when I was doing my sex coaching certificate. And it's actually created by sex therapists and sex educators with real life couples or singles. And they're all on specific topics of sex. And they actually, you know, they teach you sort of tantra, oral sex techniques, sensual massage, and they're all explicit videos. But I think that's also a really good resource for people who are watching porn to get ideas, you know, as a couple.
That's a really great tip. That's a fantastic tip. Sara, thank you so much for meeting me today and sharing your wisdom and the wealth of knowledge that you've got from your sex education courses and your sex coaching courses. It's so interesting, and it's a topic that really should be discussed. And I hope that this opens up conversations between couples and parents and teenagers and really gets people thinking about ethical porn watching, because I think that is really where the future of porn should be.
Yes, I agree.
For my listeners out there, Sara has her own podcast called Better in Bed, and it's on season 2 now, or you're about to start season 2. Go and check that out. And the episode that she does with me is also called Better in Bed, and that is around about episode 49, I think. Thanks so much, Sara. And for my listeners out there, if you've enjoyed this podcast and you've got friends or family who you think would benefit from hearing Sara talk about porn and to learn more about the industry and how it can impact our lives, please can you share this podcast with them? And, I meant to ask you, how can people contact you if they would like to get in touch with you for sex coaching or for, what else do you do? Sex education courses, workshops?
Yeah, mainly one-on-one coaching services, but I'm also developing a course right now, and I'm thinking about it based around the principles of getting better in bed. So all of the things that we were talking about around the skills of getting better in bed, like communication skills, challenging some of the myths that we were brought up with, you know, how to get out of your sexual comfort zone and explore things. So look out for that. My platform is sarasense.com. So SARASENSE.com. And you can always find me on Instagram as well. That's my favorite social media platform, and I'm there all the time. So hello, Sara Sense. And you can also check out the Better in Bed podcast if you are interested to listen to more sort of sex-oriented or sexuality-oriented content.
Guys, I hope you could please go on to iTunes to rate and review me, because it will help bring my podcast up the iTunes charts. It will also help more people be able to find Sarah so that they can get some sex education workshops or couples counseling or whatever it is that they need. And if you could go on to Patreon, if you'd like to support Hong Kong Confidential, because I don't have any funding for all of the work that I'm putting into this, then you could even just donate $1 a month through Patreon, find Hong Kong Confidential and support me. That would be absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Always pleasure.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Well, I don't know what topic.
Lots of pleasure.
I know. Pardon the pun. I don't know what topic we're going to do next, but we're definitely going to do another one.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.